Welcome to the Best Music Podcast, where we see behind the curtain and discover the hidden habits and success secrets of noteworthy music makers, so you, the listener or viewer, can speed up your journey to your dream music goals by taking what you need from their wins and lessons learned along the way. I'm your host, Dan Spencer, and this week's featured guest is John O'Hara. Born in Liverpool in 1962, John's family relocated to north of Wales in the early 1970s, where John joined the National Youth Orchestra of Wales. He played in several bands with his father before moving to the Royal Northern College of Music, studying contemporary percussion, drum kit, and piano. After 5 years of graduate and postgraduate studies, he joined Rambert Dance Company, London, as a percussionist, enjoying extensive touring for a further 5 years. After still more years, these years are adding up, gigging in bands and theater, John accepted the post as composer and musical director for the Bristol Old Vic. While working in theater, John learned the basics of bass guitar, flute, trumpet, and trombone until eventually discovering the accordion. As of 2023, release of the new Jethro Tull album, RökFlöte. There's umlauts over the O's there. I'm doing my best. It's been 20 years since John has been part of the Jethro Tull family. In 2003, he met Ian Anderson and joining the Rubbing Elbows tour on piano and accordion, subsequently recording on Rupi's Dance. Since that time, John has enjoyed touring with the band and scoring, conducting, and playing Ian's orchestral concerts. Outside of the Jethro Tulliverse, in 2004, John was commissioned to compose a children's opera by the Welsh National Opera. This was a great success and has led to further 2 pieces being commissioned. John has composed for wildlife drama and documentary TV as well. Now, John holds teaching positions at Bath and Bristol universities and is a guest tutor at the Royal Welsh College of Music. From 2007 to 2009, he helped arrange and conduct music for the college's stage production of the classic Who album, Quadrophenia. This past April, 2023, John performed with an all-star band, including Iron Maiden's Bruce Dickinson, touring John Lord's Concerto for Group and Orchestra, featuring the music of Deep Purple. John composed the closing oratorio, The Bargee's Wife, for the Three Choirs Festival, which was in the UK in 2013, and the Gloucester Magnificent for the Gloucester Cathedral in 2016. Now, during the pandemic, he composed the score for a series of short films for the Traveling Light Theater designed to help young people during lockdown. 17 and The Squeak Gobbler. These are available on YouTube. Links will be in the video description if you're watching on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're on audio. He continues to work with young performers in universities as well as drama and music schools. You can find out more, well, at jethrotull.com, facebook.com/John O'Hara Composer. That's JOHNOHARA Composer, like you spell it. On Instagram, it's John.O'Hara_composer, and again, links for all those will be in the show notes if you're on audio, or in the video description if you are on YouTube. John, thank you so much for your patience. While I flubbed my way through the English of reading your intro, for all of you who are watching and you got the edited version, lucky you. Poor John has been sitting here while I learn how to read the English language and also speak it at the same time. So, John, thank you very much for displaying the patience, which I'm sure all your students at university value greatly, and which must make you a phenomenal teacher. So, John, thank you so much for coming to spend time with me today. I'd like to ask you a couple questions because you've had such an eclectic and diverse career in so many different areas, combining so many different genres. What is it that is so important for you about mixing rock music with orchestral ideas, instruments, and arrangements?
Gosh, I think it comes back to when you're a young player and it's what inspires you. I was playing drums in bands and I was playing percussion in symphony orchestras and getting a kick out of doing both of those. And I think that's gone through the rest of my playing career, playing piano in bands, playing accordion in smaller groups. And then when you come to want to spend time and show young performers those skills while you're teaching, it's a cross-fertilization. It doesn't matter really what instrument you're playing. You can talk jazz language or you can talk classical language. And the student should have that today, I think. The student should have that flexibility of knowing both of those worlds. Okay, sometimes maybe a classical musician may be a little bit reticent about improvising or playing free music, but it can be a very freeing process for a young musician to let themselves go and to start to feel as though they can invent simple melodies around somebody vamping on some chords. And usually the students are overwhelmed with how simple the process can be on a starter level. And that's classical music and improvising music and drums and percussion, harmony-based, melodic-based, non-melodic-based material all coming together in one lesson. There's no reason why it can't just all be together.
I love it. That is literally my teaching philosophy. So, John, can you talk a little bit about why you feel it's important for the modern musician, and specifically we're talking about people who are learning music, why is it important to sort of dip a toe into all musical pools?
I think listening and the inspiration that many, many different artists from many different genres can give you will make you a better musician. It's no good just playing one particular type of music and not having a knowledge of, saying, being able to swing or being able to feel a groove or sit in the pocket with the drummer if you're a violinist, for example. And we've played a lot of rock concerts with symphony orchestras, and it's incredible as we've progressed over the last 20 years or so. You get orchestras now that will willingly sit in the pocket because they themselves have listened to Tull, to Maiden, to whatever it might be, and they go, actually, we really enjoy this music, so they are familiar with that. So the question being, what should a young person do? Listen to as much music from as many different artists as is possible. Just let it seep in. It will go in by osmosis. It will be there in your heart and in your body, and one day you'll be able to draw on that.
Kind of a pointed version of that question, tactical, around listening. If you were advising someone and they could not ask you a follow-up question, they could only ask you one question, and you wouldn't be able to change their trajectory after first giving them this advice, what would you say is, in your opinion, the optimal balance between the amount of time one continues to listen to something to really internalize it versus I'm going to listen to something new every day and never go back and listen to something twice? And let's assume this person doesn't have complete, perfect oral memory and recall, and that they are going to receive some benefit from repetition. What would you say that balance would be?
That's a difficult question, really. Going back to my previous answer, I think lots of music is a good thing, even if it's just one pass. But also, as you will know, the skill of transcription, the skill of listening to something and being able to then replicate it on your instrument, or even write it down and transcribe it onto paper, is also an important skill, but that requires repetition. Because unless you're an absolute genius, you're not going to be able to transcribe it just on one listen. I'm transcribing something at the moment, which is it's a band chart, band playing, which is then going to be opened out to a symphony orchestra in Germany. It's a commission that came in a few days ago. I know the orchestra. I know what they're able to do. I love the tracks. So I've started transcribing in great detail what the vocalist is doing, all the little inflections, the little turns, the little fall-offs, the little bluesy notes. And once I've got that notated, I can feel it's like I'd be freer with the orchestration. But that has taken a lot of repetition. Whereas I might sit down and literally play a track and never hear that song again. So without distracting from your question, I think, again, both of those worlds are so equally important, repetition and just listening to lots and lots of music by many, many, many artists.
I'm certainly fascinated. I think listeners and viewers might be as well. Can you talk a little bit about how putting in that level of effort and gaining the level of visual and notation level detail of a vocal performance will be the fertile ground from which you will be able to make so many choices? Why is it so important to get that level of detail?
Well, let's relate that to the world of Tull. When Ian offers a sketch of a song, I could just try and remember it, realizing that it's only just coming and I've got to sit down in a room and start offering some keyboard lines, some keyboard sounds, some kind of contribution from myself. I find that notating in quite a lot of detail what Ian would sing and what Ian might play enables me to understand maybe what his harmony might be, because if it's a flute line, there's not always a harmony underneath it. Whereas when you're hearing a flute line, it would suggest to you what chords you might want to play, and there'll be lots of options. Usually you start off with the obvious ones, and then you start looking for alternatives on verse 2 or on the second bridge or whatever it might be. So that level of detail is an example of how important it is being in a band, for me anyway. That's my process. Being in a band and being able to contribute fully with the knowledge of what you've learned from the demos, the MP3s that you've been listening to.
Is there a level of insight, in addition to setting yourself up to harmonize a single line? Is there a level of insight that you gain into perhaps the artistic intention or the artistic spirit of the singer or the flute part? When you are notating at that level of detail, you start to see sort of like larger meta patterns, where if you were just putting it down simply, yes, you could say motif idea, this rhythm idea repeated here, but when you get into the nuances of it, there may be these finer, higher definition patterns. Is that something that you find to be true? And then how does that impact your artistic choices, taking that and translating it out to orchestra?
Well, so few artists actually do a direct copy paste. I mean, that's not the way a human performs. There's always those inflections, and that will inform you as to whether you want to do something different on the end of the second phrase. I think also when you're listening to lyric, and sometimes in Tull's music, for example, it's not boy meets girl, girl meets boy, they fall in love. It's not that kind of world. It has another poetic complexity, which is in the nature of Ian's writing, which means that you can get under the skin of the lyric, which will then inform you of what a keyboard can play. I could play piano, I could play harpsichord, I could play Hammond, I could play synths, I could play Moogs, I could play all those sounds, but it's trying to find something that is going to reflect within the lyric and the poetry within the lyric.
I would just add one thing to something you said, I think, one question ago. For anyone who's wondering what the obvious things were, the most obvious thing you could do is you could figure out the scale, harmonize the scale, and then take the 6 chords. Let's leave the diminished child at the door. I'm sorry, the diminished chord is going to have to sleep outside for the night. You just take those basic major minor chords, assuming it's going to be, I mean, even if it's something more complex than a major or natural minor scale, just harmonizing the scale, taking those chords. Forget about going to the 7th. Just those triads would be the most basic way of doing it. For anyone who's sort of starting in the music journey, just to clarify that. So,
and to add to that, on a basic level, you could then play with one hand that melody that you have in your mind or you have on the page, and you don't need to follow a textbook necessarily. You can use your ears. You can use where you want to go. So you can try out different harmonies, different triads, as you're talking about, in a left hand. Even if you have limited skills, it doesn't matter. You're still exploring the sound world by exploring those sounds in the left hand with the melody.
Yes.
I completely agree with you.
Following the ear.
Yes.
And I mean, even there's a super interesting conversation to be had, and I think we should have it, because I think a lot of people will benefit from this. I always say inspiration comes first. Like, let the inspiration flow. When the inspiration is done with you, or you're done with the inspiration, then turn to your tools of harmony and understanding theory and structure and all that stuff. And it's like, the more you internalize those rules, then they will naturally integrate with the moment of inspiration. But even there, for someone who's just starting out, what would you say, how would you best recommend for someone to follow their ears? Like, can you break that down into simple terms for someone who maybe doesn't even understand what that concept might be?
So if you're listening to music, you're listening to phrases, you're listening to cadences, and those cadences might be resolved, they might go to a place of home, a place of rest, or they might be slightly agitated and imperfect and leave you hanging in the air. And those words, perfect and imperfect and interrupted, which are all musical language, they are exactly what they say in the English dictionary. They have that same feeling in music. So when you get these phrases, these phrases that lead to cadences, if you're trying to work out those chords as we're talking about now, you will a listener will naturally be led to a place of a certain cadence. You don't have to know what the name is, but you might be resolving it so it feels as though it's going to home, or you might feel, I'm in the middle of the line, I can't go home yet, I want to continue a little bit longer. So you give some kind of an interruption to the cadence, so it doesn't feel as though it's complete, and then you can complete it at the end of the second line or at the end of the fourth line. Because notice I'm doing duples, 2s, 4s, 8s, which is a natural thing for most listeners because a lot of the music that we listen to are in those combinations. And so it's already within our body. Unless you're going to join a band called Jethro Tull when you're playing in 7 or 13 or whatever different time signatures, and bar lengths change all over the place, and it's not a regular system any longer.
Well, very fortunate we are to have such people joining such bands, and those bands existing, and people named Ian writing this type of music. So,
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, let me first ask a question. Do you feel that a song or a composition or a piece is a story?
That depends. So in classical music, there's something called a symphonic poem, which is where a classical composer is not using words, but is using sounds to tell a story. There's a composer called Richard Strauss who tells a story about a little boy who wakes up in the morning and climbs the foothills of the Alps and then reaches the steeper climbs and eventually gets up into the snow and the rainfall and the avalanche, and eventually makes his journey back down and with the cowbells in the meadow as he's coming home. That's completely notated in a sound world, almost like filmic music depicting those images and that story, basic story, but beautiful. So you can hear it in the music, you'll hear the waterfalls. So those are called symphonic poems. Sorry, the base of the question was? I've just lost that.
Well, do you think it's fair, I'll phrase it differently, do you think it's fair to categorize, let's say 99% of music as being a story? Maybe not literally a story, but in the sense that we're having some type of hero's journey, some version of the hero's journey. We're having some type of introduction, some type of, it's sometimes like you start a movie and it's like the first thing that happens is, boy, it's like action, crazy, crazy, crazy. And then it's like cut 2 weeks before. And then it's the whole movie leading back up to that action point. And sometimes you get in a movie and it's like the songbirds and the guy in the meadow. And then he goes on the journey and then finally returns back home after learning all the lessons. Do you think it's fair to say that, and again, I'm not going to say 100%, but like high 90% of music is telling some type of story?
You're probably right. You're probably right. But you might argue, say, for example, in the prog world, if you're listening to something and you've had a theme which has got some kind of story, but then the piece goes off into the world of prog, which is, can go down some rabbit holes all over the place. And eventually you might come back to something that you're familiar with, the story that we started off with. But it might be fair to say that when we've gone down those rabbit holes, we're no longer in a story world. We're just into exploring the fantastic world of prog. Similarly, as I described, you might have a tone poem written by a classical composer. The same composer might write a symphony which won't have a narrative, which won't have a storyline through it. It'll be an exploration of melodies and structures that don't follow a regular narrative, a regular storyline, but you might have feelings of passion or love or anger or war or within those pieces, but not basic themes, but not necessarily a narrative.
Can stories exist without it being a narrative? Like, can like, I'm thinking, like, if we compare this to film, I don't know if you've ever watched a film where you sort of like, it starts and it just kind of, it's like Prague. It just kind of meanders, and not that Prague doesn't have a point to it, but in the sense that, like, if you listen to a Dream Theater album and it's like the places you are going have almost nothing to do with where you started, and then sometimes you find your way back. Maybe you find your way back at the very end of the album, right? Can we even call that a story? Or what's a useful way? Because humans, we always like to sort of categorize things in order to think about them, compare them to others. John, what would you say a useful way of thinking about this type of music would be that's not attached to a linear narrative?
I think a lot of that kind of music is a place where you can escape without having to worry about a narrative. You can enjoy that world. Danny Darko, the film, it's not, you have no real idea what's going on, and it's giving you so many different things all of the time. You have to watch it multiple times. And I wouldn't say it was a story that started here and finished over there. I wouldn't say it was that at all. So maybe you can relate that film to a piece of music that doesn't have a linear narrative. Going back to the classical world, we've got the minimalist movements and the Steve Reich music, for example, which is just a repetitive pattern that might play for 15 minutes. It's asking you to come out of your present conscious state and go into another meditative world where you can release yourself from having to consider narrative It's just to sit there, to breathe, to experience what it is, and to start to hear things that actually aren't there. But you start to hear stuff. You start to create counter melodies and clashes within that world. But it's your mind that's doing it. It's you that's doing it. And that's the glory of that minimalist world, is they're asking you to release yourself and to enjoy the process. Not to get bored after 2 minutes, go through that threshold. It's like when you're jogging, hit the wall and keep going.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Huh. Never thought about it that way. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, John. John, can you talk a little bit about composing for wildlife? How do you approach it? What's your thought process? How do you allow inspiration to occur? Or do you control inspiration and try and do something that's more directed towards what you think is like painting the scene?
Working in that medium, you're working as part of a team, and you're working to a director's vision. Often in all those wonderful, wonderful Attenborough the wildlife movies that we have over here in the UK, that you will be seeing over there in the States, there's been a big movement to hone into the emotion or the sentiment or the nature of a particular animal. For example, the majestic whale, which is out in the open ocean, which seems to be moving in slow motion, and yet it's giant, it's huge in this vast open space. And you might want to play big, luscious chords, big, long, slow melodies. You don't want to put something silly underneath that. It just won't work. It's not what we're looking at. It's not the power of the beast. Whereas you might play something of the other nature if you were looking at a whole load of ants, wild killer ants doing their things. You might come across something that's more comical, more staccato, more silly. So you're following your instincts about what you think that animal is all about to you. And then you offer, in a short demo to picture, you offer that to the director and find out whether you're both seeing the same thing. Because everyone's got a different idea of what that should be, what that animal is all about. But you are really, really working with that director. So you've got to, first of all, get past that post before you can go any further.
You are an incredible collaborator just based on your CV, just based on the experience you've had. Clearly, you have incredible people skills, because it takes great people skills to be a collaborator over a long duration of time. It takes building good relationships. What are some of the top things, some of the cardinal rules you either have within yourself or that you find that you do naturally that lend themselves to being an excellent collaborator?
Collaboration with other musicians, with other artists, is one of the most rewarding parts about being a musician. It cannot be something that you do on your own. You have to be able to share it with the other people in the room or on the platform. And it's not playing something amazing so that you can try and impress another musician. That's not collaboration. That's called showing off. It's much more of a, I can do that. That's going to make you sound amazing. I once heard a fantastic jazz musician talk about how nervous he sometimes got when he was playing. And he said, I realized that what I needed to do was stop listening to myself and start listening to everybody else. And then I really start to enjoy everybody else's performance. And I've completely forgotten that I was nervous, or that I was getting nervous, because I'm now really enjoying other people's performances. And that is, in the jazz world, that's a massively important collaborative thing to be able to do, is to listen. working with people off the stage, for example, theatre directors or TV directors. It's about sharing some similar ideas and passions for the project you're working on. 17 in the Squeak Gobbler was a project where we all came into a room at some distressing times during lockdown and the pandemic. And we were all on Zoom and trying to make projects long distance. But we spent so much time on screen getting to know each other and sharing our passions, what we might be reading, what we might be listening to, that the collaborative process was more about sharing coffee and thoughts. And then when you start to make art together, you realize that I know what that person wants because of all the things that that person might have said. I know where she's going with this. And actually, I've got something that will really enhance that in my mind. So it's understanding the person behind the art, behind the music, behind the filmmaking, behind the directing. It's not just the music making.
How do you balance the supporting of other ideas with your idea too? Because everything you've said so far is very much about listening to the other and allowing the other to do something and then complementing that thing. At what point, or is there a point at which you say, this is the idea, and then have others come and do the same for you? Because if everyone's always looking to everyone else, it just turns into a circle of everyone turn this way. Someone at some point needs to say, here we go.
I think it's important to have what I like to call a safe space. So I think it's important that you can say something within an environment and feel that you're not going to be laughed at or somebody's going to think that you're silly. And that's what I call a safe space. If you do have that safe space, then you can express what you really are feeling at that moment. But it requires everybody in the room to have mutual respect. Let's go back again to the most recent album. There was a moment in the room when we were playing this song over and over again, it's a song called Navigator. And it seemed to have a repetition of a certain section. And after playing it for maybe half an hour in rehearsals and trying to jam around on some new ideas, I stuck my hand up and said, Ian, I think what we maybe need to do is find some really dirty 4/4 bass line that's really, really heavy that will add a counter to the top flute lines and the top guitar lines. I didn't know what it was going to be. I was just searching for something that could be there. And I was trusting that all the guys in the band would allow that safe space to happen and allow me simply to say, I think something's missing. I think we could find something here. And then I suggested something and it was slightly altered with the bass player and myself. Boom, we had it. It was on the album. But it wouldn't have been there if I hadn't have felt that I could express my thought about needing something. I keep saying the word safe space. I think it's such an important thing in all walks of life, whether you're in office worlds or whether you're in the arts, just being able to feel comfortable to express yourself. There's a wonderful thing in medicine now, in operating theatres, where you walk into the theatre and you've got all these amazingly skilled people. And now there's a movement where everybody gets introduced. Everyone introduces themselves by their Christian name, by their first name, all the way around the room. I'm John. I'm here today to hold the tools for the surgeon, whatever their job might be. And going around the room, so everybody feels as though they have a right to be present in that space. And so consequently, in an operating theatre, if something starts to go a little bit wayward, you're all a team, and you're all in that position together. It's not the captain, it's not the surgeon who's in charge. Somebody downstairs can say, actually, I think what we need to do is look at this. And that is the epitome of a safe space. And it works.
What an incredible lesson. So I think there's one missing piece from this. And while it may be obvious for some, I don't think it's going to be obvious for everyone. And that is, can you talk about the way in which, and let's use the example when you're in the studio recording the album or doing the rehearsals for the album, the way in which you raised that suggestion. Because from what I was hearing, you weren't dictating. So can you talk a little bit about how you personally, John, because clearly it works. It's worked for you for quite some time. So what you are doing has been proven to work, both in groups and also for you as a career. Can you explain the way that you, when you have an idea, you express that idea to others? Like what's going on in your tone, how forceful is the language you're using or not?
Well, I should first of all say that I have a huge amount of respect for everybody in that outfit and to most outfits that I operate in. And with that level of respect, you don't come ploughing in an abusive tone. It just doesn't work. So in this instance, I suggested that the idea that something else should happen in this section of music. I didn't know what. It was just a gut feeling. And the room went quiet for a moment. But with the mutual respect within the room, it was like, let's give John a moment here. Let's see what he wants to do. And then I had to come up with something. So I came up with something that just popped into my mind. But I think it's that mutual respect that gives people the room to think without having to cloud the space with a load of white noise and conversation. And I was able to think for a moment and come up with a thought. Sound checks in other bands, for example, when you have a musician who might be not hearing what they want and they're getting frustrated and upset because it's really loud, but they're not hearing what they want to hear, but they can't seem to sort it out. Sometimes what you need to be able to do is ask directly one question: what is it you're missing? What is it that's making you feel really insecure on stage? And that person will then go, actually what it is I've got no idea where one is in the beat, or whatever it might be. And then you can say, well, why don't you ask for this? And make everything else go away. And sometimes that simple suggestion of, you've got a problem, what is the problem? Tell us what the problem is. Be quite specific. And this is, again, with people who respect each other. And then you can go to a sound guy and say, can you make it warmer and make it less harsh? And let's hear where the click is or where the hi-hat time is, for example. I hope that's explaining it.
I think it is. And I think what an incredible lesson in leadership and taking agency and putting the best interests of the group at the forefront. Truly. What an incredible lesson. And we're here talking about music, but my gosh, you do that in life. Like, do that with people in your life who are upset. It's like you see your partner's upset. It's like, what do we need to do? Like, what's the heart of what's going on here? Such an incredible lesson in communication. And so, I think what the small amount of value I could add here is to point out to everyone who's listening or watching the way in which John has communicated throughout this entire conversation we've had. He's been clear, measured, asked for clarification if he needs it. It's like, what an incredible collaborator. What an incredible human being. What incredible communication skills. Like, John, you are a walking music lesson. not just from the work you've done, but as evidenced by how you hold yourself and who you are as a person, is a music lesson.
As a quick example, I remember being quite frightened standing in front of a symphony orchestra on the podium with a baton in hand. They don't know you. They have no idea what your CV is. The first time they saw you is when you mounted that podium and stood in front of them, and they're looking at you. And they are vastly experienced, hugely gifted performers, musicians of all instruments. And what they want from you is respect, and they want you to be able to express your wishes clearly, simply, and without loads of florid language. They just want it there because their time is tight. They've got so little time to be faffing around, and really what they want to do is play music. So if you can be clear, precise, respectful, then you can get so much more out of 80 musicians, 70 musicians, however many you're standing in front of, and you get a cohesive, respectful ensemble.
That will be the last lesson we'll have today from John. John's got to run. John, thank you so very much for taking some of your valuable time to come be here with us and be so concise, to the point, precise, and impart so much wisdom. Again, not just from your career, not just from the tactical, strategic things we talked about today, but also in the way in which you communicate, because music it's communication. It's back and forth, and you've shown today how we can all become better communicators, not just in music, but also in life and in talking. So thank you so very much. It's been an honor talking with you. It's been a pleasure to meet you. You're welcome back anytime, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dan. It's great fun.